I'm Jamie Dimon. I'm the CEO of J.P. Morgan Chase, and I'm going to tell you about a $25 billion decision. This decision wasn't just about money. It was about the independence of American banking. The decision I made that day changed our relationship with the government forever. And even today, we're living with the consequences of that decision. It was 2009. The financial crisis had just ended. Other banks were still struggling to stay afloat. And I was sitting across from Treasury Secretary Tim Geithner. There was a check on the table for $25 billion. TARP funds, the government bailout money they had given us. Geithner said to me, "Jamie, keep this money. It's cheap capital. Use it to rebuild your bank." Any CEO would have accepted this offer. It was like free money. But I was thinking differently. I said to him, "Tim, we're going to pay this money back, all of it, as soon as possible." I can't forget the expression on his face. He was shocked. "Jamie, why? This doesn't make sense. Other banks are keeping this money. Why are you doing something different?" What I explained to him at that moment shaped the future of banking. "Tim," I said, "there's no such thing as free money. Every dollar you take, you have to pay something in return. And sometimes that price is more valuable than the money itself." What was that price? Independence. Freedom. The right to make our own decisions. Because when the government gives you money, it brings rules with it. It brings control. And I didn't want J.P. Morgan to become a plaything for politicians. But the real reason went deeper. After the 2008 crisis, the way the government interfered with banks scared me. Not just financial interference, operational interference, determining CEO salaries, interfering with credit policies, influencing business decisions. When I saw this, I understood. If I keep this money, J.P. Morgan won't be my bank anymore. It will be the government's bank. And I'll just be a salaried manager, not a real CEO. When I left that meeting, I told my team, "We're going to pay back the $25 billion. I don't know how we'll find it, but we'll find it." My CFO, Doug Bronstein, said to me, "Jamie, this is impossible. This money can be paid back in 2 years at the earliest." I said to him, "Doug, let's pay it back in 6 months." Why was I being so hasty? Because every day that passed, government control was increasing. Every month, new regulations were coming, new restrictions, new interventions. But here's the truly shocking part. Other bankers thought I was crazy. My colleagues on Wall Street would call me and say, "Jamie, what are you doing? This money is free capital. Why are you giving it back?" And that's when I realized something that would change everything about how I thought about power and control. The other CEOs weren't just keeping the money because it was cheap capital. They were keeping it because they were afraid. Afraid of having to find $25 billion on their own. Afraid of operating without government backup. Afraid of true independence. But I had learned something from the 2008 crisis that they apparently hadn't. Government money always comes with strings attached, and those strings eventually become chains. The question wasn't whether we could afford to give back $25 billion. The question was whether we could afford not to. This is where I'll tell you the real story behind that decision. The real story was this. I had seen what happened to banks that became dependent on government money. They stopped being banks. They became extensions of government policy. And I refused to let that happen to J.P. Morgan. Look at what happened to AIG. They took government money. What was the result? The government owned 80% of the company. Government officials were sitting in board meetings. Political appointees were making business decisions. CEO salaries were determined by bureaucrats who had never run a business in their lives. Look at General Motors. Government bailout, government control, politicians deciding which factories to close, which models to produce, which dealers to shut down. That wasn't business anymore. That was politics disguised as business. I saw this pattern and made a decision. J.P. Morgan would never become a government-controlled entity, not while I was CEO, even if it meant giving up $25 billion in cheap capital. But the truly shocking part had not been revealed. Yet, the decision to pay back TARP wasn't just about independence, it was about survival. Because I saw something coming that other bankers missed. I saw the political backlash. By late 2009, public anger about bank bailouts was reaching a boiling point. Politicians were looking for scapegoats, and banks that had taken TARP money were easy targets. They could be hauled before Congress, humiliated on television, and subjected to punitive regulations. But banks that had paid back their TARP funds, they had moral authority. They could say, "We took the money when the system needed stability. We paid it back when we could. We're not dependent on taxpayers anymore." That moral authority was worth more than $25 billion because it gave us freedom to operate independently, to make business decisions without political interference, to serve our customers without government second-guessing. Stop here, because this detail changes everything about how you should think about independence and control. Most people think the person with the most money has the most power. Wrong. The person with the most independence has the most power. Here's what happened that convinced me I was right. In 2010, Congress passed Dodd-Frank, sweeping new regulations for banks. But when they came to write the rules, they needed input from the industry. Who did they turn to? The banks that had proven their independence, the banks that had paid back TARP. JP Morgan had a seat at the table during those negotiations, not because we were the biggest bank, but because we were the most independent bank. We had credibility that other banks didn't have, and that credibility translated into influence over our own regulatory future. Meanwhile, banks that still owed TARP money were treated like supplicants. They had to accept whatever rules were imposed on them. They had no negotiating power because they were still dependent on government support. The $25 billion decision wasn't just about paying back a bank loan. It was about positioning JP Morgan for the next decade of banking regulation. And that positioning was worth far more than the money we gave up. But here's the part that nearly broke me psychologically: the personal cost of that decision. Because paying back $25 billion in 6 months meant finding $25 billion in capital. And that was money we couldn't use for growth acquisitions or shareholder returns. So far, you've only seen the strategic benefits of independence. The real cost was what we couldn't do while we were raising that money. We couldn't make acquisitions that would have been profitable. We couldn't expand into new markets. We couldn't return as much money to shareholders. Every dollar we used to pay back TARP was a dollar we couldn't use to grow the business. My board questioned the decision. Some shareholders criticized it. Analysts said I was being unnecessarily conservative. But I knew something they didn't. Short-term sacrifice for long-term independence was the best investment JP Morgan could make. Here's how we found the $25 billion. First, we cut every non-essential expense: marketing budgets, travel expenses, office renovations. If it wasn't absolutely necessary for operations, it was cut. Second, we accelerated asset sales. Properties we had planned to hold, we sold. Securities we had planned to keep, we liquidated. Third, and this was the hardest part, we delayed growth initiatives. New branches we had planned to open, delayed. Technology upgrades we wanted to implement, postponed. Hiring we had planned to do, frozen. The bank operated in austerity mode for 6 months, but the most difficult part was explaining to our employees why we were doing this, why we were voluntarily giving up $25 billion when other banks were keeping their TARP money, why we were cutting costs and delaying growth when we had access to cheap government capital. I held town halls with employees across the company. I explained my philosophy. We're not just building a profitable bank. We're building an independent bank, and independence has a price. We're willing to pay that price because the alternative is worse. The alternative was government control. And I had seen enough of government control to know it was incompatible with excellent banking. Politicians make decisions based on political considerations, not business logic. Bureaucrats prioritize compliance over customer service. Regulators focus on avoiding problems, not creating opportunities. JP Morgan needed to be free to make business decisions based on business criteria, to serve customers based on their needs, not government priorities, to allocate capital based on returns, not political objectives. But here's what happened that vindicated the decision completely. By early 2010, we had paid back the entire $25 billion, and immediately our competitive position improved. While other banks were still dealing with government oversight, we were free to pursue opportunities. We acquired Bear Stearns assets that other banks couldn't touch because of government restrictions. We expanded into markets other banks couldn't enter because of regulatory limitations. We hired talent other banks couldn't attract because of compensation restrictions. The decision no one expected came next. Instead of celebrating our independence, I announced we were going to maintain the financial discipline we had learned during the payback period. The cost cutting, the focus on efficiency, the careful capital allocation. These weren't temporary measures, they were permanent changes. This is where most people misunderstand what real independence means. It's not just freedom from external control. It's the internal discipline to maintain that freedom. Because the moment you become financially dependent, you lose your independence again. So we built JP Morgan to be financially self-sufficient under any circumstances. High capital ratios, strong liquidity, diversified revenue streams. We never wanted to be in a position where we needed government assistance again. This brings me to the lesson that changed my entire approach to leadership. The lesson was this: independence isn't something you achieve once. It's something you defend every day. Because there are always forces trying to make you dependent. Government, regulators, shareholders, even your own board. Everyone wants some form of control over your decisions. The only way to maintain independence is to maintain financial strength. Not just adequate strength, overwhelming strength. Enough capital to survive any crisis, enough liquidity to fund operations without external help. Enough profitability to satisfy stakeholders without compromising principles. That's why, even after paying back TARP, we continued to build capital far beyond regulatory requirements. Other banks said we were being too conservative, holding too much cash, keeping too much capital. But I learned from 2008 that adequacy isn't enough. You need overwhelming financial strength. Here's what happened in 2020 that proved this strategy was right. COVID hit. The economy shut down. Credit markets froze. Companies needed emergency funding. And once again, JP Morgan was able to step up when others couldn't. We provided $50 billion in emergency credit to companies. We kept credit lines open when other banks were restricting them. We funded small business loans when other banks were pulling back. Why could we do this? Because we had maintained the financial independence to act when others were paralyzed by uncertainty. But here's the part that nearly broke me personally. The realization that financial independence requires personal sacrifice, because every dollar we kept in capital was a dollar we didn't return to shareholders. Every conservative decision we made was growth we didn't pursue. Shareholders criticized us for being too conservative. "You're not maximizing returns," they said. "You're holding too much cash. You're missing growth opportunities." And they were right. We were being conservative. We were missing some opportunities. But we were also maintaining our independence. The truly shocking part had not been revealed yet. The real cost of independence isn't financial. It's psychological. Because when you're truly independent, you're also truly responsible. You can't blame anyone else for your decisions. You can't point to government restrictions or regulatory limitations. Every choice is yours. That responsibility is crushing. When other banks failed during COVID and blamed it on unprecedented circumstances, we couldn't use that excuse. We had positioned ourselves to handle unprecedented circumstances, so when we succeeded, it was our success. But if we had failed, it would have been our failure alone. Let me tell you about the night I almost changed my mind about independence. It was March 2020. The Fed was offering unlimited liquidity to banks. Unlimited, free money basically. And I sat in my office, staring at that offer, wondering if I was being foolish. Other banks were taking that money. Smart CEOs, experienced bankers, people I respected. They were accessing Fed facilities, borrowing at near zero rates, building their liquidity cushions with government support. And I was sitting there, using our own capital, our own resources. My CFO came to me and said, "Jamie, maybe we should reconsider. This isn't about dependence. This is about taking advantage of available resources." For a moment, I wavered. Maybe I was being too rigid. Maybe independence didn't require rejecting all government support. But then I remembered why I had made the TARP decision in 2009. It wasn't about the money. It was about the principle. The moment you become dependent on government support, you lose the ability to make independent decisions. And independent decision-making was more valuable than any amount of cheap capital. During that period, people asked me how I justified maintaining such strict independence when other successful banks were more flexible. The justification was simple. Flexibility and dependence aren't the same thing. True flexibility comes from strength, not from access to external support. When you're financially strong enough to handle any situation independently, you have maximum flexibility. When you depend on others, your flexibility is limited by their priorities. JP Morgan's independence gave us flexibility that government-dependent banks didn't have. We could enter markets they couldn't touch. We could make acquisitions they couldn't afford. We could take risks they weren't allowed to take. Our independence became our competitive advantage. But let me tell you something that might surprise you. The real test of independence isn't what you do during crises. It's what you do during good times, when money is easy, when everyone is making profits, when government support seems unnecessary. That's when maintaining independence requires real discipline. In 2021, the economy was booming. Bank profits were at record levels. Government support was still available, but nobody thought they needed it. And that's when I made another decision that shocked the industry. I announced that JP Morgan would maintain the same capital levels, the same liquidity standards, the same conservative approach that we had used during the crisis, even though the crisis was over. Even though we could have loosened up, pursued more aggressive growth, taken more risk. Why? Because independence isn't situational. You don't maintain financial strength only during crises. You maintain it all the time, so you're ready for the next crisis. And there's always a next crisis. Here's what I learned about independence that applies to any business, any career, any life decision. First, independence is expensive. It requires sacrifice, discipline, and saying no to opportunities that could be profitable but would compromise your autonomy. Second, independence is lonely. When you make decisions based on your own principles rather than external pressures, you often stand alone. Shareholders might criticize you. Peers might think you're being too conservative. But if you're right, the long-term benefits far outweigh the short-term criticism. Third, independence compounds. The stronger your position becomes, the more independent you can be. The more independent you are, the better decisions you can make. The better decisions you make, the stronger your position becomes. It's a virtuous cycle, but it takes years to build. The $25 billion TARP decision wasn't just about paying back a loan. It was about establishing a principle that has guided JP Morgan for 15 years. We will maintain our independence at any cost. Because independence isn't just a business strategy, it's a survival strategy. I'm Jamie Dimon. I've run JP Morgan Chase for 18 years. And the most important decision I've ever made wasn't about growth or profits or acquisitions. It was about independence, because everything else flows from that. When you're independent, you can make decisions based on what's right, not what's politically expedient. When you're independent, you can serve your customers' interests, not government priorities. When you're independent, you can build long-term value, not short-term compliance. The question isn't whether independence is worth $25 billion. The question is whether dependence is worth any amount of money. And my answer, after 18 years of running the world's most successful bank, is absolutely not. Independence is the foundation of everything else. Lose that, and you lose the ability to serve your customers, your shareholders, and your employees. Maintain that, and you can build something that lasts. That's the real story of the $25 billion decision. It wasn't about money. It was about freedom. And freedom, once lost, is almost impossible to recover.